Dad said, "You'll never be as good as your brother." I stood up and said, "Then ask him to pay your bills." And now he hides in shame, while I own the empire they once mocked me for even dreaming of. Okay, so Sunday dinners. Ugh. Just the phrase makes my stomach clench, a tight knot forming right below my ribs. Even now, years later, I can still taste the metallic tang of anxiety on the back of my tongue. They were a thing in our family. Every single Sunday. At our ridiculously oversized house in Houston, a sprawling, faux Mediterranean monstrosity that my dad, Robert, loved to flaunt. He saw it as a monument to his success, a gleaming symbol of his self-proclaimed business acumen, even if that success was, let's be honest, largely built on the back of my mom's inheritance. It was all so performative, like a scene from a bad reality show about a picture-perfect family, except we were anything but perfect, miles and miles, light years even, from it. There was always this thick, suffocating undercurrent of tension, this simmering resentment that hung in the air like a noxious gas, threatening to explode at any moment. My brother Jason, the golden child, would be there, of course. Perfect posture, like he'd swallowed a yardstick, perfect smile, all teeth and no warmth, perfectly regurgitating whatever business jargon Dad had been spouting all week. He'd arrive in his latest German sports car, the engine purring like a satisfied predator, a stark contrast to my beat-up Honda Civic. My mom, bless her soul, would flutter around, refilling wine glasses with an almost frantic energy, playing the role of the doting wife, smoothing over the cracks in our fractured family facade. And me, I'd be there too, perched precariously on the edge of one of the stiff-backed dining chairs, trying to shrink myself, trying to become invisible, to blend into the expensive wallpaper, because the less attention I drew to myself, the less likely I was to be the target of Dad's constructive criticism. Which, let's be honest, was just a thinly veiled barrage of insults, disguised as fatherly advice, each barb meticulously crafted to chip away at my self-worth. It was always the same damn script. Jason, radiating self-satisfaction, would hold court, talking about his latest promotion. Another rung climbed on the corporate ladder, courtesy of Dad's connections, I'd silently add. His new car, a company perk, he'd explain with a wink. His ridiculously low golf handicap, achieved, I suspected, with more than a little creative scorekeeping. Dad would beam, puffing out his chest like a preening peacock, his face flushed with paternal pride. "That's my boy," he'd bellow, clapping Jason on the back hard enough to rattle his perfectly aligned teeth. The force of the impact would send a ripple through the meticulously set table, the crystal glasses chiming a discordant symphony. Then, the inevitable pivot. He'd turn to me, that fake, strained smile plastered on his face, his eyes glinting with something that looked suspiciously like disdain, and say something like, "See, Amanda? This is what hard work looks like. This is what success is. Why can't you be more like your brother? He's got his life together." And the worst part? Jason, the smug bastard, would just sit there with this knowing smirk playing on his lips, soaking it all in, basking in the reflected glory. Like he deserved all the praise, like he was some kind of deity amongst us mere mortals. It made my blood boil, a hot, angry tide rising in my chest, threatening to choke me. I'd grip my fork so tightly my knuckles would turn white. The conversations were always so surface level. We'd talk about the weather, always too hot, always too humid. The stock market, Dad's latest investment triumphs naturally. Local politics, carefully avoiding any topics that might spark actual debate. Anything to avoid the real issues, the giant snarling elephant in the room that was our dysfunctional, toxic family dynamic. But underneath the polite, stilted chatter, I could practically feel the weight of my father's judgment, the palpable disapproval radiating off of him like heat from a furnace. I could feel Jason's smugness, the way he'd subtly glance at me when Dad praised him, a flicker of triumph in his eyes, as if to say, "See? I told you I was better. I told you I was the favorite." It was suffocating. Absolutely, utterly suffocating. And Sunday after Sunday, I'd sit there, forcing a smile, a grotesque parody of genuine happiness, pretending everything was fine, while inside, I was slowly, methodically dying, a piece of me withering away with each condescending remark, each forced laugh, each excruciatingly long, drawn-out meal. It wasn't just the Sunday dinners, though they were definitely a concentrated dose of toxicity. It was a constant, insidious drip of comparison and belittling that had been going on for as long as I could remember. Like the time I was 12 and won first place in the school science fair. I'd spent weeks, months even, painstakingly building my project, a ridiculously complicated model of the solar system, complete with tiny hand-painted planets and a working light-up sun. I was so proud, bursting with excitement to show it off to my parents. But when I presented it, beaming, at the dinner table, Dad just grunted, barely glancing at it. "That's nice, Amanda," he mumbled, his eyes already drifting back to the sports section of the newspaper. Then, turning to Jason, who'd gotten a C on a history test, he said, quote, "Jason, your Uncle Mark told me you have a real knack for business. He thinks you could be CEO of his company one day." The solar system, my pride and joy, my weeks of hard work, was forgotten, eclipsed by Jason's mediocre grade in a subject he didn't even care about. It was like a punch to the gut, the air whooshing out of my lungs, leaving me deflated and empty. Then there was the time I told them I wanted to start my own business. I'd always been entrepreneurial, even as a kid. I'd set up lemonade stands, organized neighborhood bake sales, even started a small dog walking business. I had a vision, a burning desire to create something of my own. So fresh out of college, bubbling with enthusiasm, I presented my business plan to my parents, a meticulously crafted document outlining my vision for an online marketplace for handmade goods. Dad actually scoffed, and said, "That's cute, Amanda, but it's just a hobby, a little side hustle. It'll never be a real business. You should focus on getting a stable job, like your brother." Jason, predictably, chimed in with, "Yeah, Amanda, the real world is tough. You need a steady paycheck, benefits. This internet stuff is just a fad." He delivered the words with a condescending pat on my head, like I was a naive child playing make-believe. Their words, their lack of belief, stung. They burrowed deep, lodging themselves in my heart like tiny, poisonous splinters. But they also fueled me, ignited a fire in my belly, a fierce determination to prove them wrong. It wasn't that Jason was actively cruel, not exactly. It was more his subtle digs, his constant need to one-up me, the way he'd always managed to steer the conversation back to his own achievements. He'd casually mention his latest bonus, his upcoming promotion, his expensive new watch, all while maintaining this air of effortless superiority. It was like he was constantly reminding me, reminding everyone, that he was the chosen one, the golden boy, the one who lived up to Dad's impossibly high standards. And by extension, that I was the failure, the disappointment, the one who would always fall short. Each instance, each comment, each subtle jab, chipped away at my self-esteem, eroding my confidence, leaving me feeling small and insignificant. I started to doubt myself, to question my own abilities, to wonder if they were right, if I was destined to live in Jason's shadow forever. But deep down, beneath the layers of self-doubt and insecurity, a tiny ember of defiance flickered. I knew I was capable of more. I knew I had something to prove, not just to them but to myself. And that ember, that tiny spark of defiance, would eventually grow into a raging inferno, consuming all the doubt and insecurity, leaving behind only a steely resolve to forge my own path, to build my own empire, to show them all, especially my father and brother, just how wrong they were about me. It was a particularly sweltering Sunday in July, the air thick and heavy with humidity. Even the ice in my water glass seemed to melt faster than usual, the condensation dripping onto the pristine white tablecloth, a small, spreading stain on the otherwise perfect surface. The air conditioning was blasting, but it couldn't quite penetrate the stifling atmosphere of forced pleasantries and simmering resentment. We were halfway through the usual roast chicken and roasted vegetables, the clinking of silverware against china the only sound punctuating the strained conversation. Dad was holding forth on some new business deal, his voice booming across the table, peppered with jargon I barely understood and, honestly, didn't care about. Jason, predictably, was nodding along, interjecting with his own insightful comments, showcasing his deep understanding of the intricacies of high finance. Mom, as always, was playing the role of the attentive listener, her smile fixed and a little too bright. I was pushing the food around on my plate, trying to look busy, trying to avoid eye contact. The conversation, as it so often did, drifted towards Jason's career. He'd just been promoted again, something about senior vice president of something or other. Dad was practically bursting with pride, his face flushed, his eyes shining. "He's a natural," he boomed, gesturing towards Jason with a flourish. "A born leader. He's got the Midas touch, just like his old man." Jason, basking in the praise, gave me a quick, smug glance, a barely perceptible smirk playing on his lips. It was a look that said, "See? I told you, I'm the one who matters." My stomach twisted, the knot tightening. I took a deep breath, trying to remain calm, trying to remind myself that it wasn't worth it, that engaging would only make things worse. But the words, like tiny, venomous darts, had already found their mark. Then, Dad turned to me, his smile vanishing, replaced by an expression that was almost pitying. He sighed, a heavy, theatrical sigh, and said, in a voice dripping with condescension, "Amanda, when are you going to get your act together? You're 30 years old. You're still messing around with that website of yours. When are you going to get a real job? A real career? When are you going to make something of yourself?" The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. The room seemed to shrink, the walls closing in on me, the air thick with unspoken judgment. I could feel everyone's eyes on me, the weight of their expectations, their disappointment, pressing down on me like a physical burden. My hands trembled, my fork clattering against my plate. I opened my mouth to speak, to defend myself, to explain, for the 1,000th time, that my online marketplace was, in fact, a real business, a thriving, successful business. But before I could utter a word, he delivered the final blow, the one that shattered the fragile facade of civility, the one that sent the simmering resentment boiling over. He looked me straight in the eye, his gaze cold and hard, and said, clear as a bell, in a voice laced with disdain, "You'll never be as good as your brother, Jason." The words echoed in the sudden, stunned silence that followed. The clinking of silverware ceased, the hum of the air conditioning seemed to fade into the background. Even Mom stopped smiling, her face pale and drawn. It was as if time itself had stopped, frozen in that moment of utter humiliation. My heart pounded in my chest, a frantic drumbeat against my ribs. My breath caught in my throat, a choked sob trapped in my chest. The room spun, the faces around the table blurring into a kaleidoscope of shock and disbelief. And in that moment, something inside me snapped. Years of suppressed anger, years of resentment, years of feeling inadequate and unworthy rose to the surface, and a tidal wave of defiance. A wave of heat washed over me, starting as a tremor in my chest and spreading like wildfire to my fingertips. My palms prickled with a strange, almost electric energy. It wasn't just anger, it was something deeper, something primal, a raw, untamed force that surged through my veins. Humiliation, yes, a burning shame that scorched my cheeks, but also this white-hot rage, a sudden, exhilarating surge of defiance that crackled in the air around me. I felt like a cornered animal, backed into a corner for years, finally baring its teeth, ready to fight. The carefully constructed walls I'd built around myself, the years of pretending I didn't care, that his words didn't hurt, crumbled into dust, leaving me exposed and vulnerable, but also strangely liberated. I didn't think, I just reacted. My body moved before my mind could catch up. I pushed my chair back with a sudden, violent shove, the legs scraping against the polished wood floor. a harsh, jarring sound that shattered the stunned silence, echoing in the cavernous dining room. The sound, sharp and unexpected, seemed to jolt the others back to reality. I stood up, my legs trembling slightly but my resolve unwavering. My hands, still tingling with that strange energy, gripped the edge of the mahogany table, my knuckles white, the tendons standing out like taut ropes. I could feel my heart hammering against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage, desperate to escape. My breath hitched in my throat, making it difficult to speak, but the words, when they came, were surprisingly steady, almost calm, but with an underlying edge of steel. Then ask Jason to pay your bills. The words hung in the air, thick and heavy, charged with years of unspoken resentment, of swallowed anger, of forced smiles and silent tears. My gaze locked onto my father's, unflinching. I watched as the color drained from his face, the ruddy complexion fading to a sickly gray. His eyes, usually so full of bluster and self-importance, widened in disbelief, the pupils shrinking to pinpricks. The smug smirk vanished from Jason's face, replaced by an expression of stunned confusion. He opened his mouth to speak, to defend himself, to offer some witty retort, but no sound came out. He just sat there, gaping like a fish out of water, his perfectly coiffed hair slightly askew, his carefully constructed image of effortless superiority crumbling before my eyes. My mom gasped, a small, choked sound, her hand flying to her mouth as if to stifle a scream. Her eyes, wide with alarm, darted nervously between me and my father, her face pale and drawn. Aunt Susan, who had been silently picking at her salad throughout the entire ordeal, dropped her fork with a clatter, the metal tines scraping against the china plate. Uncle Mark, ever the peacemaker, cleared his throat awkwardly, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. "Now, Amanda," he began, his voice hesitant, placating, "I'm sure your father didn't mean it like that." "Oh, he meant it." I cut him off, my voice sharp, brittle. "He's meant it for years. He's made it perfectly clear that Jason is the golden child, the successful one, the one who's worthy of his love and approval. And I'm... what? The disappointment? The failure? The one who will never measure up?" My voice cracked slightly on the last words, the years of hurt and resentment threatening to break through the surface. My father opened his mouth to speak, to protest, but I held up a hand, silencing him. "Don't," I said, my voice low and steady. "Just don't. I'm done. I'm done with the comparisons, the insults disguised as advice, the constant reminders of how I'll never be good enough. I'm done with this charade." I turned and walked away, my head held high, my steps firm and resolute, leaving the wreckage of the Sunday dinner, and perhaps the wreckage of my family, behind me. No one moved. No one spoke. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, broken only by the frantic thumping of my own heart and the receding sound of my own footsteps echoing in the hallway. It was as if the entire world had stopped, holding its breath, waiting for the aftershocks to hit. I felt a strange sense of detachment, like I was watching the scene unfold from outside my own body, a spectator in my own life. This wasn't me, the quiet, compliant Amanda, who always swallowed her anger, who always tried to please. This was someone else. Someone stronger, someone fiercer, someone who refused to be silenced any longer, someone who had finally found her voice. The silence that followed my outburst was deafening, thick, heavy, suffocating. I didn't turn back, didn't dare to see the expressions on their faces. I could feel their eyes boring into my back, burning holes in my skin. I walked away, my legs trembling, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I didn't stop until I reached my car, the beat-up Honda Civic that Jason had so often sneered at. I fumbled with the keys, my hand shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. Finally, the engine sputtered to life, a welcome roar that drowned out the silence, the accusations, the years of accumulated resentment. I peeled out of the driveway, gravel spitting from beneath the tires, leaving the suffocating atmosphere of that house, of that family, behind me. Later, I heard bits and pieces of what happened after I left. Apparently, my dad just sat there, stunned into silence, his face ashen. My mom, bless her heart, tried to smooth things over, stammering something about me being stressed and overworked. Aunt Susan, ever the drama queen, burst into tears, wailing about how disrespectful I was, how I'd shamed the family. Uncle Mark, predictably, tried to play the role of the mediator, suggesting that we all just calm down and talk it out, but the damage was done. The words had been spoken, the silence shattered, the carefully constructed facade of our perfect family irrevocably broken. Jason, according to my mom, was surprisingly quiet. No smug remarks, no witty retorts, no attempts to escalate the situation, just silence. I imagine he was shocked, thrown off balance by my outburst. He'd probably never been challenged like that before, never had anyone stand up to him, to my father, and call them out on their bullshit. It must have been a novel experience for him, the golden boy, the one who always got his way. The following days were a blur of anxiety and anger. I replayed the scene over and over in my head, dissecting every word, every expression, every nuance. Part of me, a small, defiant part, felt a surge of satisfaction, a sense of righteous anger. I'd finally said what I'd been holding in for years. I'd finally stood up for myself, refused to be silenced, refused to be belittled. But another part of me, a quieter, more insecure part, was plagued by doubt. Had I gone too far? Had I crossed a line? Was I the asshole? I'd never spoken to my father like that before, never challenged his authority so directly. In our family, respect for elders, especially for the patriarch, was paramount. And I just publicly, in front of the entire family, ripped that respect to shreds. The phone call started, of course. First my mom, her voice trembling with anxiety, pleading with me to apologize to my father, to make things right. Then Aunt Susan, her voice dripping with disapproval, lecturing me on the importance of respect and filial piety. Even Uncle Mark, the ever-patient peacemaker, called, suggesting that I extend an olive branch, that we all sit down and have a civilized conversation. But I refused. I wasn't ready to apologize, not yet. I needed time to process what had happened, time to sort through the tangled mess of emotions swirling inside me. I needed to figure out what I wanted, what I needed, before I could even begin to think about reconciliation. The silence between my father and me stretched, a vast, echoing chasm that seemed to grow wider with each passing day. It was a silence filled with unspoken words, with unresolved anger, with the shattered remnants of a relationship that might never be repaired. And in that silence, I started to build my empire. The days after the great Sunday dinner explosion were a weird, disorienting mix of exhilaration and crippling self-doubt. At first, the adrenaline rush was intoxicating. I felt like a goddamn superhero, like I'd finally broken free from the kryptonite grip of my family's expectations. I walked around with this weird, manic energy, fueled by righteous anger, and a fierce determination to prove them all wrong. I poured every ounce of that energy, every drop of that anger, into my business. I worked around the clock, barely sleeping, barely eating, driven by this primal need to succeed, to build something so undeniably successful, so monumentally impressive, that it would shove their doubts right back down their throats. For a while it worked. The anger was a shield, protecting me from the creeping tendrils of doubt, from the whispers of, what if? I'd picture their faces, their shocked expressions, the stunned silence that followed my outburst, and it would fuel me, push me forward. They think I'm nothing? I'd mutter to myself, hunched over my laptop at 3 a.m., fueled by caffeine and pure, unadulterated spite. I'll show them nothing. I'll show them what I'm really capable of. But then, slowly, insidiously, the doubt started to creep in. Little whispers at first, barely audible above the roar of my ambition. Did you go too far? They'd hiss. Was it really necessary to say that? To humiliate him like that? In front of everyone? The whispers grew louder, more insistent, gnawing at the edges of my confidence, chipping away at the carefully constructed wall of righteous anger I'd built around myself. I started replaying the scene in my head, not with the triumphant satisfaction of the first few days, but with a growing sense of unease. I saw my father's face, not the stunned, ashen mask of the moment, but the lines of weariness etched around his eyes, the slight tremor in his hand as he reached for his wineglass. I remembered the way his shoulders slumped, as if the weight of my words, of years of unspoken resentment, had finally become too heavy to bear. And for the first time, I saw not the monster I'd built him up to be in my mind, but a flawed, aging man, clinging to the illusion of control, desperately trying to maintain the image of the successful patriarch. The guilt started then, a slow, insidious burn in the pit of my stomach. I'd always craved his validation, his approval. I'd spent my entire life trying to earn his love, to prove that I was worthy of his attention, his respect. And now, in one moment of explosive anger, I'd pushed him away, perhaps irrevocably. Had I destroyed any chance of ever having the relationship I so desperately craved? Had I traded years of resentment for a lifetime of regret? The silence from my family was deafening. No phone calls, no emails, no texts. It was like they'd collectively decided to erase me from their lives, to pretend I didn't exist. And the worst part? Part of me, a small, twisted part, was relieved. The silence was a reprieve, a temporary escape from the suffocating weight of their expectations, their judgments, their constant comparisons. But it was also a constant reminder of the damage I'd done, of the relationships I'd fractured, perhaps beyond repair. I was alone, adrift in a sea of self-doubt and uncertainty, clinging to the wreckage of my anger, wondering if it had all been worth it. Had I finally found my voice, or had I simply screamed into the void, alienating the very people I'd been trying to reach? I honestly didn't know. I was lost, adrift, and desperately seeking an anchor, a lifeline, something to hold on to in the swirling chaos of my own making. Fast forward 5 years. 5 years of relentless work, of sleepless nights and caffeine-fueled days. 5 years of pouring every ounce of my energy, every drop of my anger, into building my hobby, my little side hustle. And let me tell you, that little side hustle blossomed into something they never could have imagined. My online marketplace exploded. It became the place to find unique, handcrafted goods. We went from a small, scrappy startup to a multi-million-dollar company, featured in Forbes, praised by industry experts, desired by investors. I built my empire, brick by painstaking brick, fueled by their doubt, their disbelief, their condescending smirks. I was living proof that their narrow definition of success was bullshit. I had my penthouse overlooking the city, my team of dedicated employees, my name on the cover of magazines. I had everything I'd ever dreamed of, everything they said I'd never achieve. And it felt complicated. The success was intoxicating, validating, a giant, glittering fuck you to everyone who ever doubted me. But it didn't erase the hurt, the years of feeling inadequate, the gnawing emptiness that their lack of belief had carved inside me. And then, the universe, in its infinite sense of irony, decided to throw me a curveball. The phone rang. An unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something, a flicker of morbid curiosity, made me pick up. Amanda? The voice was hesitant, weak, almost unrecognizable. But I knew it. It was him, my father. Robert, the man who had spent my entire life telling me I'd never amount to anything. He needed money. A lot of it. His investments had gone south. His business acumen had apparently failed him. And he was facing foreclosure. He'd exhausted all his other options, he mumbled, his voice thick with shame. He'd even asked Jason, but Jason, the golden boy, the born leader, had apparently developed a sudden case of amnesia when it came to his father's financial woes. So he'd come crawling to me, the daughter he'd dismissed, the one he'd said would never be as good as her brother. The irony was almost too much to bear. He didn't apologize. not directly. But the shame in his voice, the hesitant way he asked for help, the way he kept referring to me as Ms. Walker instead of Amanda, spoke volumes. He was humbled, broken, the bluster and bravado stripped away, revealing the scared, insecure man beneath the carefully constructed facade. My initial reaction was a visceral mix of satisfaction and anger. A part of me, a petty, vindictive part, wanted to laugh in his face, to remind him of all the times he'd told me I'd never amount to anything, to rub his failure in his face. But another part of me, a softer, more compassionate part, ached for him, for the broken man on the other end of the line, the man who, despite everything, was still my father. I helped him, of course. I paid off his debts, saved his house, ensured he wouldn't end up on the streets. Not for him, not really, but for me. To finally, unequivocally, prove him wrong. To show him that the daughter he'd dismissed, the one he'd deemed a failure, was the one who ultimately saved him. We haven't spoken much since. He still avoids my gaze, still calls me Ms. Walker, still hides behind a wall of awkward formality. The shame is palpable, a thick, suffocating presence that hangs in the air whenever we're in the same room. He comes to the obligatory Sunday dinners, sits quietly at the table, picking at his food, his eyes darting nervously around the room, never quite meeting mine. Jason predictably avoids the topic altogether, pretending nothing happened, his smugness replaced by a strange, almost unsettling silence. The dynamic has shifted, the power balance irrevocably altered. I'm no longer the insecure, overlooked daughter. I'm the one in control, the one holding the purse strings, the one who built her own empire from the ashes of their doubt. And yet, the victory feels hollow, tinged with a lingering sadness, a sense of loss for the relationship that could have been. So Reddit, tell me, AITA for snapping back at my dad like that, even though he constantly belittled me and favored my brother? Was my reaction justified given the years of emotional abuse? Or did I cross a line? I really don't know anymore. I need an outside perspective. Please tell me, was I the asshole?